17 Black R&B legends who turned song lyrics into real-life crimes. Some of the biggest Black R&B legends didn't just sing about obsession, revenge, violence, addiction, and control. They eventually lived it. What once sounded like powerful lyrics later became real police reports, courtroom scandals, shattered families, and public downfalls. And the most disturbing part, many fans never realized the warnings were hiding inside the music all along. Subscribe now to Black Legends Revealed before we uncover the dark, true stories behind the songs that became terrifyingly real. Sly Stone. Sly Stone built an empire out of chaos long before that chaos destroyed him publicly. As the mastermind behind Sly and the Family Stone, he created records like Family Affair and Everybody is a Star that preached unity, freedom, rebellion, and excess with explosive energy. But behind those lyrics sat a man whose real life increasingly mirrored the darkness hidden beneath the music. By the 1970s, stories surrounding Sly were no longer just about genius. They were about drugs, paranoia, violence, and behavior so unstable that concerts regularly collapsed before audiences' eyes. The criminal atmosphere around Sly Stone became impossible to separate from his image. Cocaine addiction reportedly consumed huge parts of his life, while associates described dangerous environments filled with weapons, aggressive bodyguards, and escalating paranoia inside his inner circle. Concert promoters lost massive amounts of money because Sly frequently skipped performances without warning, sometimes leaving entire arenas waiting for hours before riots nearly erupted. Former band members later spoke openly about frightening conditions backstage as drug abuse intensified around the group. Then came arrests tied to drug possession over the years, turning one of music's most revolutionary artists into a public symbol of collapse instead of liberation. How shocking is it when the man singing about freedom and celebration slowly turns his own life into a scene of addiction, fear, and self-destruction? That contradiction became the tragedy haunting Sly Stone's legacy forever. His music sounded joyful, rebellious, and spiritually alive, but offstage, his world reportedly grew darker and more dangerous as fame spiraled out of control. The deepest shock is realizing many of the themes inside Sly's music chaos, instability, rebellion, emotional darkness eventually escaped the records completely and consumed his real life in full public view. Ike Turner. Ike Turner helped shape the foundation of modern R&B long before most people realized how influential he truly was. As the force behind the Ike and Tina Turner Revue, he created explosive performances filled with energy, passion, and control. Songs like A Fool in Love and Idolize You sounded romantic on the surface, but hidden inside the lyrics was a darker obsession with possession and dominance. While audiences saw glamour, fame, and musical brilliance, Tina Turner was privately living through fear and violence behind closed doors. His lyrics were no longer entertainment. They became reflections of the man himself. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Ike Turner's abuse toward Tina reportedly became increasingly brutal. Tina later described violent beatings involving shoes, wooden objects, and repeated physical attacks whenever she challenged his authority or attempted independence. In 1974, before a concert appearance, an argument reportedly became so violent that Tina suffered serious facial injuries. Yet despite the chaos happening privately, Ike still presented himself publicly as the mastermind behind one of the hottest acts in music. The disturbing connection to the songs became impossible to ignore. Lyrics from Idolize You about complete devotion and control no longer sounded romantic once people understood what Tina was enduring in real life. Imagine performing love songs for cheering audiences while terror and manipulation waited backstage after the applause stopped. Have you ever noticed how dangerous obsession can become once someone starts confusing love with ownership? Tina Turner's eventual escape in 1976 shocked the entertainment world because it exposed the dark reality hidden behind the glamorous performances. While Ike remained musically respected for his influence on rock and R&B history, his legacy became permanently tied to abuse, control, and destruction. One of the most talented figures in black music history became one of the clearest examples of how lyrics can sometimes reveal the dangerous thinking already growing inside the person singing them. James Brown. James Brown built his entire career on power intensity and absolute control. As the godfather of soul, he transformed black music forever with explosive performances and hits like "The Payback Papa's Got a Brand New Bag" and "I Got You, I Feel Good." But behind the legendary image was someone battling paranoia, anger, and heavy drug use that slowly pushed his real life toward the same violent obsession described in some of his own music. What made James Brown's downfall so shocking was not just the crimes themselves, but how closely they echoed the rage and revenge themes already present in his songs years earlier. In 1988, Brown spiraled into one of the most chaotic moments of his life after reportedly using PCP, a powerful hallucinogenic drug. Convinced people were against him and consumed by jealousy involving his wife, he entered an insurance office carrying weapons, including a shotgun, and terrified employees while screaming threats connected to revenge. Witnesses later described him shouting phrases similar to the anger-filled energy heard in The Payback. The situation exploded into a high-speed police chase across 2 states, with Brown refusing to stop while police vehicles surrounded him. Have you ever seen fame collapse so publicly that the same man once celebrated as untouchable suddenly appears completely consumed by paranoia and rage? What makes James Brown's story so disturbing is that the incident permanently damaged the powerful image he had spent decades building. He was later convicted on multiple charges, connected to assault, resisting arrest, and dangerous driving, serving prison time, while the public watched his downfall unfold in real time. The tragic irony is that The Payback had already captured the exact mindset that would later help destroy his reputation. Revenge obsession and emotional chaos exploding without control. One of the greatest performers in music history became another example of how dangerous emotions hidden inside lyrics can sometimes spill violently into real life. Joe Tex. Joe Tex built his career sounding like a preacher, comedian, street philosopher, and troublemaker all at once. Songs like Skinny Legs and All I Gotcha and Hold What You've Got mixed humor, seduction, jealousy, and confrontation into raw Southern soul stories that felt almost too real. But behind the playful performances sat years of feuds, violence, and personal chaos that pushed Joe Tex far beyond ordinary music industry drama. At times, his real life looked dangerously close to the emotional conflict exploding inside his lyrics. The most shocking part of Joe Tex's story was his bitter feud with fellow soul legend James Brown. What began as musical rivalry reportedly escalated into threats, humiliation, and fear so intense that stories circulated for years about Brown allegedly arriving at venues armed and furious over personal insults and industry tensions. Joe Tex openly mocked Brown publicly during performances, even parodying his stage style in front of audiences. The conflict became one of the nastiest rivalries in soul music history, filled with ego intimidation and genuine hostility. Meanwhile, Joe Tex's own records often centered on betrayal, revenge, masculinity, and emotional conflict themes that increasingly seemed reflected in the aggression surrounding his real-life behavior and public persona. How unbelievable is it when entertainment feuds become so personal that audiences begin wondering whether real violence could eventually happen behind the curtain? That tension followed Joe Tex for much of his career. Older audiences especially remember how unpredictable and emotionally charged his performances could feel compared to smoother R&B stars of the same era. Even after later turning toward religion and stepping away from parts of the music business temporarily, the image of Joe Tex remained connected to confrontation and emotional volatility. Rick James. Rick James did not just sing about excess. He lived inside it so recklessly that his real life eventually became darker than the outrageous lyrics shocking audiences during the 1980s. Songs like Super Freak, Give It To Me Baby, and Cold Blooded turned him into the wildest figure in funk music, a man openly celebrating drugs, sex domination, and chaos with almost no filter. At first, fans treated it like dangerous entertainment. Then America realized the destruction was becoming horrifyingly real. The collapse exploded publicly during the early 1990s when Rick James faced criminal charges connected to assaults against two women in separate incidents involving drug-fueled violence. Prosecutors described terrifying situations involving kidnapping, abuse, and severe physical harm tied to cocaine addiction, spiraling completely out of control. Suddenly, lyrics that once sounded rebellious and seductive became deeply uncomfortable in retrospect, because the chaos inside his music now appeared connected to real criminal behavior off-stage. James was eventually convicted on assault-related charges and sentenced to prison, shocking older R&B audiences who remembered him as one of funk's most charismatic stars. How disturbing is it when the outrageous behavior an artist brags about in music suddenly turns into courtroom testimony and prison sentences in real life? That transformation permanently changed Rick James's legacy. During his peak years, he represented fearless black rebellion, sexual freedom, and explosive musical creativity unlike anyone else in entertainment. But addiction, paranoia, and escalating violence slowly consumed the image completely. Even after his release from prison and occasional career revival attempts, the criminal cases remained impossible to separate from his story publicly. The deepest shock surrounding Rick James is not simply that he broke laws. It is how closely his real life eventually mirrored the darkness, excess, and danger already hiding inside the music itself. Little Milton. Little Milton built his reputation on songs filled with passion, heartbreak, and emotional desperation. But one violent night made people look at his music in a completely different way, with classics like Grits Ain't Groceries and We're Gonna Make It. Milton became one of the most respected voices in blues and R&B during the 1960s and 1970s. His music sounded smooth, soulful, and deeply emotional, especially when singing about love so intense that life felt meaningless without it. But behind the powerful voice was a man whose personal life became dangerously unstable whenever jealousy and betrayal entered the picture. What made his story so disturbing was how closely one of his most famous songs later connected to a real act of violence that shocked both fans and the music world. On Valentine's Day in 1988, Little Milton reportedly returned home unexpectedly and discovered his wife with another man inside their house. Rage exploded instantly. According to police reports, Milton grabbed a .357 Magnum revolver and fired multiple shots during the confrontation, striking the man in the leg and causing serious injuries. When officers arrived, witnesses claimed Milton appeared emotionally detached, almost numb from the chaos that had just unfolded around him. The terrifying irony was impossible to ignore. Years later, that same obsessive emotional mindset appeared to spill directly into real-life violence. Have you ever noticed how dangerous heartbreak can become once obsession replaces reason completely? What makes Little Milton's story especially tragic is that the shooting permanently stained the image of an artist once admired for emotional honesty and soulful storytelling. He later served jail time connected to the incident, and although he returned to performing afterward, the headlines surrounding the case followed him for the rest of his life. One of the greatest blues voices of his era became another example of how lyrics about love, jealousy, and emotional desperation can sometimes reflect the darkest realities hiding inside the artist singing them. Chuck Berry. Chuck Berry helped invent the attitude of rock and roll itself. Songs like Johnny B. Good, No Particular Place to Go and You Never Can Tell turned teenage rebellion, fast cars, sex, and danger into musical mythology. His lyrics sounded playful, reckless, and full of rule-breaking energy. But what shocked many fans later was realizing parts of Chuck Berry's real life became tangled with criminal cases and controversies serious enough to permanently darken the legacy of one of America's most influential musicians. The first major scandal exploded in 1959, when Berry was arrested under the Mann Act after transporting a teenage girl across state lines. He denied wrongdoing connected to the more serious accusations surrounding the case, but he was convicted and eventually served prison time. Then, decades later, came another deeply disturbing controversy involving hidden cameras reportedly discovered in bathrooms connected to one of his restaurant properties. Lawsuits and public outrage followed, creating fresh headlines that overshadowed the groundbreaking musical genius many fans grew up admiring. How unsettling is it when the same artist who helped define youth culture becomes associated with criminal scandals that completely change how people hear the music afterward? That contradiction became impossible to ignore near the end of Chuck Berry's life. His songs still sounded energetic, rebellious, and alive, but the man behind them carried a reputation increasingly tied to legal trouble, voyeurism allegations, and public embarrassment instead of pure artistic celebration. The deepest shock is realizing that one of the men who helped create the soundtrack of freedom and teenage excitement spent decades battling scandals serious enough to permanently complicate his place in American music history. R. Kelly. For years, R. Kelly built an image around seduction, control, secrecy, and power. Songs like Bump and Grind, Your Body's Callin', and Seems Like You're Ready made him one of the biggest R&B stars in the world during the 1990s and early 2000s. His music dominated radio weddings, clubs, and award shows, while his songwriting earned millions and shaped modern R&B culture. But behind the success, disturbing allegations followed him for decades. What made the public eventually recoil was not only the accusations themselves, but how many listeners later realized the themes inside his music sounded painfully connected to the behavior prosecutors would later describe in court. Lyrics once treated as romantic suddenly felt deeply unsettling once the full picture became impossible to ignore. For years, rumors involving underage girls' manipulation and abusive control circulated around R. Kelly, while his career continued thriving publicly. In 2002, a videotape allegedly involving a minor led to criminal charges, yet he was acquitted in 2008 and remained commercially successful afterward. But the collapse finally arrived years later, after multiple women publicly described patterns of intimidation, psychological control, and exploitation. Suddenly, songs once viewed as seductive began sounding less like fantasy and more like warnings hiding in plain sight. Have you ever seen a superstar's own music become evidence in the court of public opinion? What makes R. Kelly's downfall so shocking is how complete it became. In 2021, he was convicted on federal racketeering and sex trafficking charges, permanently destroying one of the biggest careers in R&B history. The man once called the king of R&B became a symbol of celebrity power abused behind closed doors. His story remains one of the clearest and darkest examples of how lyrics, image, and real-life behavior can collide in ways the public never expected until it was far too late. Bobby Womack. Bobby Womack sang about betrayal, temptation, guilt, and emotional destruction with such realism that listeners often felt like they were hearing confessions instead of songs. Tracks like If You Think You're Lonely, Now Woman's Gotta Have It, and Across 110th Street carried pain that sounded frighteningly authentic. But what shocked many fans later was how brutally Bobby Womack's real life mirrored the chaos, scandal, and moral collapse woven throughout his music. The most explosive scandal came after the death of soul legend Sam Cooke, who had mentored Womack early in his career. Only months after Cooke was killed in 1964, Bobby married Sam Cooke's widow, Barbara Campbell. The public backlash was immediate and vicious. Then the situation became even darker when reports surfaced that Bobby had also been involved with Cooke's teenage daughter, creating a scandal that permanently stained his reputation. Suddenly, the man singing emotionally about loyalty and heartbreak became associated with betrayal, family destruction, and public outrage. How shocking is it when the emotional chaos inside an artist's songs becomes impossible to separate from the scandals consuming his real life? That turbulence never truly left Bobby Womack's story. Drug addiction, infidelity, legal problems, and years of personal tragedy followed him for decades. He openly battled cocaine dependency during the 1980s, while several devastating family losses later deepened the pain surrounding his life. The deepest shock is realizing that one of soul music's most emotionally honest voices was not simply performing stories about moral collapse and broken relationships. He was often living inside that destruction publicly, while the world listened to the soundtrack in real time. Johnny Guitar Watson. Johnny Guitar Watson built his reputation as one of the coolest and most fearless figures in blues and funk music. But at one point, his real life became almost identical to the dangerous image he celebrated in his songs. Tracks like Gangster of Love turned Watson into a symbol of swagger, rebellion, and street confidence during the late 1950s and 1960s. His guitar style influenced generations of musicians, while his lyrics painted pictures of hustlers, risk-takers, and men living outside the rules. To audiences, it sounded entertaining, stylish, and rebellious. But behind the music, Watson was slowly moving toward real criminal behavior that made people question where the performance ended and reality truly began. In 1961, Johnny Guitar Watson reportedly took part in an armed robbery at a pawn shop in Houston, Texas. According to reports from the time, Watson and an accomplice entered the store carrying a firearm, stole cash and jewelry, then attempted to flee before police captured them hours later. The shocking part was how closely the crime resembled the dangerous lifestyle Watson had already described in Gangster of Love. Instead of sounding like fiction anymore, the song suddenly felt like a reflection of the artist himself. During questioning, Watson allegedly joked about living the role people already associated with him through the music. Have you ever noticed how fame can sometimes trap artists inside the very personas that first made audiences love them? What makes Johnny Guitar Watson's story so disturbing is that the crime permanently changed how many people viewed his music afterward. Although he eventually returned to performing and rebuilt his career, the robbery became a dark stain attached to his legacy for years. Fans could still admire his talent, innovation, and influence on funk and blues, but the violent reality behind the headlines made Gangster of Love feel far more unsettling than before. Marvin Gaye. Marvin Gaye sang about lust, betrayal, violence, addiction, and emotional collapse with such intimacy that his records often felt less like performances and more like warnings. Songs like Inner City Blues, Trouble Man, and even parts of Sexual Healing carried darkness underneath the beauty. But what made Marvin Gaye's story so haunting was how closely his real life eventually mirrored the pain, paranoia, and destruction hidden inside the music itself. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Marvin's world had become consumed by cocaine addiction, emotional instability, tax problems, and violent family conflict. Friends later described him carrying guns, battling paranoia, and spiraling mentally while isolating himself from much of the outside world. The emotional despair heard in songs about inner-city violence, spiritual confusion, and personal suffering no longer sounded artistic. It sounded autobiographical. After moving back into his parents' home during a period of emotional collapse, Marvin became trapped inside escalating arguments with his father, Reverend Marvin Gaye Sr. On April 1, 1984, the conflict exploded into deadly violence when his father shot and killed him during a confrontation inside the family home. How chilling is it when an artist spends years singing about pain, conflict, fear, and destruction only to die inside the exact emotional chaos haunting his music all along? His voice sounded smooth, spiritual, romantic, and almost heavenly. But behind the records stood a man battling demons powerful enough to destroy him publicly and privately. The deepest shock is realizing Marvin did not simply sing about troubled lives, broken homes, addiction, and emotional violence from a distance. In many ways, he was slowly documenting his own unraveling, while the world mistook the pain for beautiful music instead of a cry for help. Ray Charles. Ray Charles transformed American music with a voice that sounded powerful, wounded, and unforgettable all at once. Blind since childhood, Ray built his career through extraordinary talent and relentless determination, earning admiration across the world. But behind the genius was a man privately trapped in addiction for years while publicly performing songs filled with loneliness, temptation, pleasure, and emotional escape. What made his story so unsettling later was how closely the struggles hidden inside his music mirrored the dangerous reality controlling his life off stage. Throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, Ray Charles battled a severe heroin addiction that became increasingly impossible to hide. While fans saw a confident superstar commanding stages, Ray was reportedly spending enormous amounts of money feeding a habit that consumed both his health and personal relationships. In 1961, the situation finally exploded publicly when he was arrested on drug charges after narcotics officers allegedly discovered heroin and marijuana in his hotel room in Indianapolis. The arrest shocked the entertainment industry, because Ray was no longer just a rising artist. He was already one of the biggest names in black music. Suddenly, songs filled with emotional pain and reckless escape sounded far darker to listeners who now understood the addiction behind the voice. Have you ever noticed how some artists unknowingly reveal their private battles long before the public learns the truth? What makes Ray Charles's story especially powerful is that he eventually confronted the addiction, instead of allowing it to completely destroy him. After the arrest and mounting pressure surrounding his drug use, Ray entered treatment and later spoke openly about the damage heroin caused in his life. Unlike many legends consumed permanently by addiction, he survived the collapse and rebuilt both his career and reputation. But the public humiliation surrounding his arrest remained one of the darkest chapters in the life of a man whose music had already been quietly exposing the pain he was trying so desperately to escape. Whitney Houston. Whitney Houston once looked untouchable. With songs like I Will Always Love You, Greatest Love of All, and Saving All My Love for You, she became one of the biggest voices in music history, admired for elegance, beauty, and vocal perfection. But behind the glamorous image was a woman slowly collapsing under addiction, emotional pressure, and public scrutiny that followed her everywhere. What made Whitney's downfall so disturbing was how many of her songs already carried themes of emotional dependence, desperation, loneliness, and toxic love, years before the world fully saw her real struggles. The pain hidden inside the music eventually became impossible to separate from the tragedy unfolding in her actual life. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Whitney Houston's drug use was becoming increasingly visible to the public. Missed interviews, erratic appearances, canceled performances, and shocking television moments slowly replaced the image of the flawless superstar people once knew. Her relationship with Bobby Brown became tabloid obsession with constant headlines about arguments, drugs, and emotional instability. Then came the infamous 2002 interview where Whitney openly joked about drug rumors while millions watched her appearance and behavior closely. Suddenly, songs about overwhelming love and emotional surrender sounded painfully different to listeners who now understood the chaos surrounding her private life. Have you ever watched a legend slowly unravel while the entire world turned their pain into entertainment? What makes Whitney Houston's story especially heartbreaking is that her talent never disappeared even while addiction damaged her life publicly. She remained one of the greatest vocalists in music history, but the headlines increasingly focused on decline instead of brilliance. In 2012, Whitney died in a Beverly Hills hotel at only 48 years old, shocking fans worldwide and permanently turning one of the most celebrated voices in music into one of its saddest cautionary tales. Donny Hathaway. Donny Hathaway sang like a man carrying unbearable emotional weight long before the public fully understood how serious his suffering truly was. Songs like A Song for You, The Ghetto, and For All We Know sounded intimate, wounded, and spiritually exhausted in ways that felt almost frighteningly personal. His real life became consumed by mental illness, paranoia, emotional collapse, and tragic behavior that increasingly mirrored the darkness hidden inside his lyrics. As his fame grew during the 1970s, Hathaway quietly battled severe mental health struggles, later identified as paranoid schizophrenia. Friends, musicians, and collaborators described terrifying moments where Donny believed people were trying to harm him or control his thoughts. During recording sessions, his emotional state could shift suddenly from brilliance to fear and confusion. At one point, reports described him refusing to perform or becoming convinced recording equipment was connected to conspiracies against him. The emotional fragility heard inside songs about loneliness, suffering, and desperation no longer sounded symbolic. It sounded terrifyingly real. How heartbreaking is it when an artist's most emotional music slowly begins sounding less like art and more like evidence of a private collapse happening in front of everyone? That collapse reached its devastating ending in January 1979. While staying at a hotel in New York during recording sessions with Roberta Flack, Donny Hathaway died after falling from his hotel room window at only 33 years old. Authorities ruled the death a suicide. The deepest shock is realizing Donny Hathaway was not simply singing about pain, confusion, and emotional suffering from a distance. He was living inside those struggles daily, while creating some of the most emotionally vulnerable music soul music has ever produced. Phyllis Hyman. Phyllis Hyman sang about loneliness, heartbreak, and emotional exhaustion with such painful honesty that many listeners later realized her music sounded less like performance and more like confession. With songs like Living All Alone, Old Friend, and You Know How to Love Me, she became one of the most respected voices in soul and R&B during the late 1970s and 1980s. Her deep emotional delivery made every lyric feel personal, almost fragile, as if she were exposing pieces of herself directly through the microphone. But behind the elegance, beauty, and extraordinary talent was a woman privately battling depression, bipolar disorder, failed relationships, and emotional isolation that slowly consumed her life. What makes her story so haunting is how closely the pain inside her music reflected the tragedy that later unfolded in reality. Throughout her career, Phyllis reportedly struggled with severe emotional instability while continuing to perform for audiences who often had no idea how much she was suffering privately. Friends and colleagues later described periods of deep sadness, self-doubt, and emotional collapse hidden behind her polished stage presence. Songs like Living All Alone suddenly sounded terrifyingly literal once people understood how isolated she truly felt off stage. In June 1995, only hours before a scheduled performance at the Apollo Theater, Phyllis Hyman died by suicide inside her New York apartment at 45 years old. Investigators later discovered a note expressing exhaustion and emotional pain after years of inner struggle. Have you ever noticed how some of the saddest songs feel almost like cries for help once the truth finally comes out? Fans admired the strength and vulnerability inside her music without fully realizing how much of it came directly from real suffering. After her death, many listeners returned to her songs and heard them differently forever. One of the most emotionally powerful women in R&B history became another tragic example of how deeply personal pain can quietly shape the very music that makes an artist legendary. Wynonie Harris. Wynonie Harris was already turning rhythm and blues into something dangerous long before rock and roll officially exploded across America. His records were loud, sexual, rebellious, and packed with double meanings so bold they shocked audiences during the 1940s and 1950s. Songs like Good Rockin' Tonight and All She Wants to Do Is Rock sounded wild, reckless, and almost lawless for their era. But what made Wynonie Harris unforgettable was how closely his real life mirrored the uncontrollable energy and trouble erupting through his music. Harris built a reputation for heavy drinking, womanizing, gambling, and violent confrontations that followed him from clubs to backstage rooms across the country. Stories about fights, unstable behavior, and chaotic touring conditions surrounded him constantly during his peak years. Unlike smoother performers carefully protecting polished images, Wynonie leaned directly into danger and excess publicly. The swagger inside his lyrics about partying, lust, and rebellion did not feel fictional because audiences often saw that same recklessness explode off stage in real life. How shocking is it when the man singing about chaos and wild living appears to be genuinely unable to escape that same destruction himself? That lifestyle eventually caught up with him brutally. as younger artists inspired by his sound became richer and more famous. Wynonie Harris's own career declined sharply. Financial struggles, health problems, and fading visibility slowly replaced the excitement of his earlier years. The deepest shock is realizing Wynonie Harris did not simply perform dangerous music. He lived with the same instability, excess, and recklessness pulsing through his records until the chaos eventually consumed much of the life behind the legend itself. Tyrone Davis. Tyrone Davis built his career singing about temptation, regret, cheating, and emotional weakness. But over time, his real life began sounding disturbingly similar to the stories inside his music. With hits like Can I Change My Mind, Turn Back the Hands of Time, and Cheating in the Next Room, Davis became one of the defining voices of soul music during the 1970s. His songs often focused on men trapped between desire and guilt, desperately trying to repair damage after betrayal had already happened. The music sounded smooth and romantic on stage, but off-stage relationships around him were slowly collapsing under infidelity, anger, and public scandal. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Tyrone Davis reportedly became known for repeated affairs and unstable relationships involving multiple women at the same time. Friends and people close to his circle described a pattern of emotional conflict, arguments, and repeated attempts to return to relationships after betrayal had already destroyed trust. One of the most shocking incidents reportedly occurred after a confrontation connected to an affair turned violent, leaving Davis facing intense public embarrassment and legal problems. Suddenly, songs like Can I Change My Mind no longer sounded like fictional storytelling. They felt like direct reflections of a man repeatedly damaging his own life through the same destructive behavior described in the lyrics. Have you ever noticed how some artists unknowingly expose their own personal weaknesses long before the public fully understands them? What makes Tyrone Davis's story especially tragic is that his talent remained undeniable even while his personal life became increasingly messy behind the scenes. Fans still admired the emotional vulnerability in his voice, but the scandals attached to his relationships slowly changed how some people viewed the music itself. The painful irony is that the man asking for forgiveness in his songs often seemed unable to truly change in reality. One of soul music's smoothest voices became another example of how lyrics about betrayal and emotional confusion can sometimes reveal the private chaos already growing inside the artist singing them. These Black R&B legends gave the world unforgettable music, but behind the lyrics were dangerous obsessions, addictions, violence, jealousy, and emotional darkness that eventually spilled into real life. Some songs sounded romantic at first until the crime scandals and public collapses made people hear those lyrics differently forever. But were these songs warnings hiding in plain sight? Or simply reflections of broken lives already falling apart behind fame? And which story shocked you the most? Share your thoughts below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow Black Legends Revealed for more dark, untold stories behind Black music history and the legends who changed it forever.